The fuel pier alarm started screaming at 2:14 in the morning. And by 2:16, every blast door on the base had sealed itself without a single human hand touching the controls. I know because I was standing under one when it dropped. Pier 7, between the maintenance shed and the seawall, a 40,000-pound steel slab coming down faster than steel that heavy is supposed to move. There's a sound that kind of mass makes when it falls. A sound that isn't really a sound at all, but a pressure, a thing you feel in the soft parts of your body before your ears catch up to it. I felt the wind of it on the back of my neck, and I threw myself forward onto the concrete. Palms first. And the bottom edge of that door clipped the heel of my left boot and tore it clean off. The door hit the deck with a concussion that I felt come up through the floor and into my chest and out the top of my skull. And a fine grit of old paint and rust shook loose from the frame and settled over me like dirty snow. And then the silence afterward was worse than the alarm, because the alarm had stopped too. Everything stopped. The floodlights that had lit the pier my whole working life gone dark in the same instant. The gulls that roosted on the seawall, silent. The diesel hum of the standby generators that had been the background heartbeat of Cormorant Point for 19 years. Gone, just gone, leaving a hole in the night where the sound used to be. I lay there on the cold concrete with one boot heel torn away and the rust grit in my mouth, breathing salt air and cordite and the particular ozone smell of a high-voltage system that has just done something violent. And I understood something I had no words for yet. The base hadn't gone into lockdown to keep something out. The doors had come down to keep something in. With us. I want to take 10 seconds before I tell you the rest. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these. And if this is your first night with me, you're welcome here. If this kind of story is what you're after, stay with the channel, leave a comment, and we'll keep going into the dark together. Now, let me get back to the pier, because the worst part hadn't even started yet. My name is Hollis Vane. I was 51 years old that night, a civilian facilities engineer contracted to Naval Support Activity Cormorant Point, which is not a name you'll find on any map because the base was officially decommissioned in 2009 and unofficially never closed at all. There are a lot of places like that on the cold coasts, if you know how to read the signs. A gate that's rusted but greased. A road that goes nowhere but gets plowed in winter. A power bill somewhere that somebody keeps quietly paying for a facility that doesn't exist. Cormorant Point was one of those. The official story was that we were a caretaker detachment, keeping the lights on so the buildings didn't rot before the property could be sold. The real story was that nobody was ever going to sell it, and that the lights stayed on for reasons that lived inside the one building the rest of us learned not to ask about. My job was the bones of the place. Power distribution, the desalination plant, the fuel farm, the cooling loops for the buildings. Nobody was supposed to ask questions about. I knew where every cable ran and every valve sat because I'd spent 2 decades crawling through the conduits that fed them. On my back in the dark with a headlamp and a wrench. Learning the base the way you learn a body you've shared a bed with for half your life. By touch, by sound, by the particular way it complained when something was wrong. If you'd asked me at 2:13 that morning what could possibly bring the whole base down at once, I'd have laughed at you. And then I'd have told you nothing could. The lockdown system was compartmentalized on purpose. Each sector had its own controller, its own logic, its own power. They weren't supposed to be able to talk to each other. That isolation was a design principle, drilled into me by the men who'd trained me, men who were retired or dead now. You never give a containment system a single point of failure. You never let the doors all listen to the same voice. They'd listen to the same voice anyway. All of them, in the same 2 seconds. I got up off the concrete slowly, the way a man my age gets up off cold concrete, feeling each joint report in. My palms were scraped and bleeding a little where I'd caught myself. I stood in the dark with my back against the sealed blast door, the steel of it still faintly warm against my shoulder blades from the friction of its fall. And I made myself do what I always do when something breaks, which is to stop feeling and start counting. I had a flashlight on my belt, the small machined aluminum one I'd carried for years. And I clicked it on and checked the beam and clicked it off again to save it. Maybe 40 minutes of battery if I was careful, less if it was cold. And it was cold. It was February cold. The kind that gets into the metal of everything and makes batteries lie to you. I had a multi-tool. I had a radio that was now showing nothing but a flat, dead hiss across every channel I keyed. The white noise sound of a band with nothing alive on it. And I had a key card that I already suspected was a dead piece of plastic in my pocket. Because a base that seals every door without a human hand is not a base that's going to honor a contractor's access credentials. The pier behind me was sealed off, that steel slab between me and the water. The path inland, the route back toward the main compound, and my truck and the road off the point, was sealed off too. Another door I could see as a darker rectangle against the dark. I was standing in a concrete corridor, maybe 60 feet long, open to the sky above the line of the seawall. And the only light in the whole world was the cold, bone white of stars and a low moon coming and going behind February cloud. And at the far end of that corridor, the one direction not blocked by a blast door, was the stairwell down into the lower utility level. The part of the base most people pretended didn't exist. The part I'd spent 19 years pretending right along with them. I should explain why I was even out there at 2 a.m, because it matters for everything that came after. I'd been called out at 11:40 the previous night by the duty officer, a young lieutenant named Park, about a pressure anomaly in the seawater intake for Building D's cooling loop. I remember being annoyed about it. I'd been asleep, the good deep sleep of a man who'd worked a long day, and the phone had pulled me out of it, and Park's voice had been doing that thing young officers do when they want to sound calm and only manage to sound careful. Building D was one of the ones nobody asked about. I didn't have clearance to know what was inside it. I had clearance to keep it cold. And that night, something was wrong with keeping it cold. The intake pressure was climbing instead of holding. I want you to understand why that woke me up the way it did. A cooling loop in steady state is a boring thing. Beautifully boring. Pressure sitting on a number and staying there hour after hour, year after year. A climbing intake pressure means one of two things, and neither of them is good. Either there's a blockage downstream, something clogging the return so the pumps have to push harder, or there's a demand spike, something on the far end, suddenly calling for more cold than the system was set to deliver. A blockage at midnight I could understand. A jellyfish in the screens, silt off the bottom after a storm. But a demand spike at midnight, in a building running a skeleton load, with most of its systems supposedly idle? That made no sense at all. Something inside Building D was getting warmer, and it was getting warmer fast enough that the building had woken up and started fighting it. So I dressed in the dark and driven the access road out to the point with my headlights cutting her through the sea fog, the Nasinirayan, and I'd gone to check the intake manifold by the pier, because that was the only place I could read the raw numbers without going through Building D's own controls, which I wasn't allowed to touch. The manifold was a cluster of valves and gauges in a steel cabinet bolted to the seawall, fed by the great submerged intake pipes that pulled water off the harbor bottom to cool whatever needed cooling. I'd had the cabinet open and my headlamp on the gauges for maybe 20 minutes, watching that intake pressure climb a little, hold, climb a little more, frowning at it, trying to make it make sense, when the fuel pier alarm went off and the whole world sealed itself shut. I want to be honest about what kind of man I was that night, because it explains the mistakes I made, and I made several, and people died of some of them. I was a man who trusted systems. 19 years of telling people that the base was safe because the engineering was sound, that the redundancies held, that nothing about Cormorant Point could fail in a way I hadn't already planned for. I believed in pressure gauges and breaker panels, and the cold, clean logic of a building that does exactly what its design tells it to do. I took comfort in it. When the rest of my life had gone sideways, and a fair amount of it had, the systems were always there, always honest, always behaving the way the numbers said they should. A breaker doesn't lie to you. A pressure gauge doesn't leave. That belief was the spine of me, and it was about to get a lot of people killed. And I want you to understand that I didn't see it coming, because I'd spent my whole career refusing to imagine that the system itself could be the thing trying to hurt me. The thought was simply outside the shape of how I understood the world. The stairwell light was still working. That was the first wrong thing. And it took me a few seconds standing there in the cold to register why it bothered me so much. Everything else on the surface had gone dark when the doors dropped. Every floodlight, every window, every safety lamp, dark. But the utility stairwell down to the lower level had power. A single fixture glowing a steady amber down at the bottom of the steps, throwing a soft rectangle of light up onto the concrete. And I stood there, and I thought it through, the way I thought through everything, tracing the power in my head. That light was running on emergency power. It had to be. The generators were dead, the grid feed was cut, so the only thing left was the deep battery banks I maintained myself in a vault under Building C. And those banks were supposed to feed life safety systems first, in a strict priority order I had helped write. Exit signs, fire suppression, the medical bay, the communications room. Not a utility stairwell that led nowhere anyone was supposed to go. A stairwell down into the lower level was about the lowest priority load on the whole base. It should have been the first thing shed. Not a thing kept burning while the surface went black. Unless someone had reprioritized the load. Unless someone, somewhere, sometime before this night, had reached into the logic of the emergency power system and decided that getting people down into the lower level was now a life safety function. That keeping that one stairwell lit mattered more than keeping the lights on in the rooms where people slept. I went down. What else was I going to do? The pier was sealed. The surface was sealed. My radio was dead. And my truck was on the wrong side of a 40,000-pound door. And the only thing worse than going into the dark is standing still next to a steel slab you can't open while you wait to find out what it was protecting you from. My torn boot slapped wrong on each step, a flat slap where the other foot gave a clean knock, and that small, uneven rhythm followed me down into the ground like a limp. The stairwell smelled like sea air at first, the clean, cold brine I'd breathed my whole life out here. Then, as I descended, it smelled like hot electronics, that distinctive cook dust smell of equipment running harder than it should. And then, underneath both of those, very faintly, there was something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet, but that I'd come to know intimately before the night was over. It was Swedish and wrong and organic. The smell of meat that has decided to stop being meat. And it crawled up out of the dark to meet me. And the animal part of my brain, the part older than all my engineering, told me to turn around. I didn't turn around. I told myself it was a dead rat in a wall void. I told myself a lot of things on those stairs. The lower utility level was a single long corridor with rooms off either side, running roughly under the spine of the base, from the seaward end to the inland end. I knew it the way you know a hallway in your own house. It connected the desalination plant, the main switchgear room, the deep battery vault, a handful of pump rooms, and electrical closets. And at the far end, through a door I'd been through maybe a dozen times in 19 years, and never once alone, the service entrance to Building D. The corridor was concrete. Walls and floor and ceiling all the same poured gray, painted institutional green to about waist height and bare above that, with cable trays running along the ceiling and pipes painted in their old color codes. Blue for potable, green for seawater, yellow for fuel. The corridor lights ran the length of it, the same emergency amber as the stairwell, and they were behaving strangely. They flickered, settled, flickered again, in a rhythm that wasn't random. I stopped on the bottom step and watched them do it, because a flickering light is a sentence if you know how to read it, and I knew how to read it. A random flicker is a loose connection, a dying bulb, a corroded contact. This wasn't random. This was a pulse, a brownout and recovery, brownout and recovery. The signature of a load somewhere downstream, pulling huge gulps of current and then releasing it, dragging the whole bus voltage down each time it gulped. I'd seen that signature before, in motor tests, in pump startups. Something on this level was cycling hard, surging, 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 and every surge was robbing the lights. And I already knew what it was, didn't I? Building D's cooling loop, the thing fighting whatever was making the intake pressure climb. Down here, this close, I could feel the fight in the very lights over my head. Halfway down the corridor, I found Park. The lieutenant was sitting against the wall outside the switchgear room with his sidearm in his lap and his radio in his other hand, his knees drawn up, his back flat to the green-painted concrete. And when he saw my flashlight come around, he didn't raise the weapon, which told me everything about the state he was in. He'd been waiting for someone and hoping it would be a friend, and was too far gone in his own fear to be careful about which it was. He was 26, maybe 27, with a kind of fresh scrubbed look that the sea air hadn't yet weathered out of him. The kind of young officer who still believed the chain of command was a real and solid thing that would catch him if he fell. His face in the cone of my flashlight was the gray of old putty, and there was a sheen of sweat on it despite the cold. And his hands, I noticed, were not quite steady on the grip of the pistol. "Vane," he said. And his voice cracked on the single syllable, and he cleared his throat and got it back under control with an effort I could see. "Thank God. The comms are down. Everything's down. I can't raise the OOD. I can't raise the gate. I can't raise anyone. I've been keying every channel for 40 minutes, and there's nothing, just that hiss." "I know," I said. "Mine's the same." I crouched down to his level, slow, my knees cracking loud enough that he flinched at it. The doors came down on their own, all of them. 2 seconds, no sequence. I was standing under one on Pier 7, and it nearly took my leg off. That's not a drill, Lieutenant, and it's not an accident either. A drill runs a sequence sector by sector, with a countdown and a klaxon. This was everything at once. Somebody armed a full base lockdown, and somebody else holds the override, and right now, I'm fairly certain it isn't either of us. I let that settle on him. "What happened in Building D, Park? Tell me what you know." He looked at me, and I watched him do the thing I've watched 100 officers and supervisors and frightened men do, which is to run the math on how much of the truth he was allowed to tell me, weighing his clearance against his terror. And I watched the math come out wrong for him, the way it always eventually does. Clearance is a thing that only works when the world above you is intact. When the world above you has sealed itself shut and gone silent, clearance is just a fence in a field with no walls left around it. I don't have access to D, he said finally. You know that. Nobody on the duty watch does. But I have the watch log, the events feed that the secure systems pushed to the duty terminal, the stuff that's cleared for monitoring even if the content isn't. And the log flagged a medical event at 23:30. Same time, near enough, as your pressure anomaly. A research staffer went down inside the secure wing. Seizure, the log said. Medical was dispatched into D. And then, he swallowed. Then the log went quiet. The medical team logged in at 23:44 and the feed stopped updating at 23:51. Just stopped. 7 minutes and then nothing. No closeout, no all clear, no nothing. Like somebody pulled the plug, or like there was nobody left to type. And then nothing for over 2 hours. The feed was just dead. I tried to call into D and got no answer. I tried to wake the OOD and he told me to monitor and not to interfere. That D handles its own internal events. And then at 01:40, he stopped answering too. Park's jaw worked. And then at 2:14, the whole base sealed. And the only thing the system would give me was a single line. It printed it to the duty terminal, the actual line printer, the old one. And then the terminal died, and the lights went. And I came down here because the down stairwell was the only thing still lit. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought you'd be down here. The power vault's down here. I thought if anyone was alive and knew anything, it'd be you. What was the line, Park? What did it print? He held up his radio, like the words were somehow on it, which they weren't. But I think he just needed something in his hand to look at, instead of my face. Containment integrity compromised. Personnel are advised that exterior egress is no longer a survivable option. I let that sit in the flickering amber for a long moment. The lights pulsed across his gray face, on and off, on and off. And somewhere down the corridor, I could hear the faint, far-off surging of the pumps. That wet, mechanical heartbeat. Survivable, I said at last. Read it back to yourself. Not unauthorized, not prohibited, not you lack clearance for exterior access. Survivable. Yeah, Park's voice dropped almost to nothing. I noticed that too. I kept reading it. I couldn't stop reading it. Here's the thing about that word, and I want you to sit with it the way the two of us sat with it in that corridor because it's the hinge the whole night turns on. A lockdown system written by the Navy is written by people who think in the language of authorization and clearance and chain of command. Its native tongue is the tongue of permission. It tells you that egress is prohibited. It tells you that you lack the clearance for that door. It tells you to remain in place, pending instruction. It does not ever, in the normal run of things, tell you that going outside will kill you, because that is not the language of doors and access levels. That is the language of someone who has stopped thinking about permission entirely and started thinking about the air. Someone who has done the math on the atmosphere itself and concluded that the open sky over Cormorant Point was now a thing that would end you. Somebody had reprogrammed the lockdown's messaging, deliberately at some point, swapping the language of permission for the language of survival. And a person only does that if they know that the threat is not a person trying to get out, but something already out, something in the air, something against which the only defense left is depth and cold, and a sealed door between you and the sky, the intake pressure climbing, the cooling loop gulping current, surge after surge. Whatever was inside Building D was getting warmer, and the building was fighting with everything it had to drag it back down. And from the way the lights were dying with every surge, it was losing. "I need to get to the switchgear room," I told Park, and I stood, my knees protesting again. "And then I need to get to the battery vault, because whatever's keeping these lights on is the same thing keeping that cooling loop alive. And they're drinking from the same well. And if the well runs dry before sunrise, the cooling stops. And I think you and I both have a feeling, even if neither of us wants to say it out loud, about what's on the other side of that door if the cooling stops." He got up off the floor in stages, the way you do when your legs have gone half to sleep with fear. One hand braced on the wall, and his knees cracked loud enough that the sound surprised him. And the surprise of it, the ordinary human smallness of it, seemed to steady him a little. He holstered the sidearm. "How long do the batteries last?" "Designed for 8 hours at the standard life safety load," I said. "That's the spec. That's what I tested them to, every quarter, for years. But that was before someone added a redlining cooling loop to the priority list. With that draw on the bank?" I closed my eyes and did the number, the way I'd done 10,000 numbers in that corridor over 19 years. The way the numbers had always been my comfort and my certainty. Except this time, the number meant something it had never meant before. This time, the number was a clock counting down to a thing in the dark. Maybe 3 hours, maybe a little less, given the cold and the age of those cells. Call it 5 in the morning. That's when the cold stops. Park looked at his watch, tilting his wrist to catch the amber light. "It's 02:41 now," he said, "and the sun comes up at 06:12. I checked at the start of my watch. I always check. Habit." So there it was. We had the gap. We had it laid out between us in the flickering corridor like a body on a table, and neither of us wanted to be the one to point at it. The thing in Building D would breach its cooling sometime around 5. The sun, and whatever rescue the daylight might or might not bring, wouldn't come until after 6. There was a window, more than an hour wide, where the most dangerous thing on the entire base would be loose in the dark. And we would be sealed inside the ground with it. And nobody on the outside would even know the doors had come down, because every radio on Cormorant Point was hissing dead static into an empty night. I want to ask you something. And I mean it. I'm not just filling the air between us. If you were standing in that corridor right now, 3 hours of battery in the wall and a sunrise too far away to reach, would you spend that time throwing yourself at doors built to stop a thing you can't even see? Hunting for a way back up to the surface the system itself is telling you will kill you? Or would you go the other way, down, toward the cold, and put everything you had into making those batteries last? Tell me honestly, in the comments, where you'd spend your 3 hours. I've turned it over more nights than I can count, and I'm still not certain I chose right. I chose down. I chose the cold. We went into the switchgear room first. The switchgear room was the heart of the lower level, and walking into it was like walking into the chest cavity of the whole base. 2 long rows of gray steel cabinets ran the length of it, floor to ceiling, full of breakers and relays and bus bars. And at the far end stood the main distribution board, a wall of analog gauges and labeled switches that I knew better than I knew my own kitchen. Better than I knew the faces of half the people I'd ever loved. I'd stood in front of that board on 1,000 quiet afternoons. I could have drawn it from memory in the dark. The first thing I noticed, before I noticed anything else, was the heat. The room was warm. Not comfortably warm, not the warm of a heated space on a cold night. It was wrong warm, a thick, close, electric warmth that I felt the instant I crossed the threshold. and it bothered me down in my gut before my mind even worked out why. Switchgear rooms run cool by design. They're full of equipment that makes heat, so the whole space is built to bleed that heat away, to stay cool no matter how hard the systems work. A warm switchgear room is a sick switchgear room. It means current is flowing somewhere at levels the design never intended, dumping heat faster than the room can shed it. I crossed to the main board, and I put my bare hand flat against it, the way you'd put a hand to a child's forehead. And the steel was hot, genuinely hot, hot enough that I pulled my hand back, hot in a way that I had never once in 19 years felt that board be. Current was pouring through it, far more than it was ever rated to carry. I traced it the way I'd traced 10,000 faults in my life, working backward from the heat to the source, my eyes moving along the labels in the bouncing light of my flashlight. The big draw was a single feeder, off in the second cabinet, labeled in faded white paint that I'd refreshed myself once, years ago. D-COOL-PRI, the primary cooling circuit for Building D, and the needle on its ammeter, one of the old analog dial gauges I'd flatly refused to let them rip out when they came through trying to digitize everything, was pinned, hard against the upper stop, all the way over, sitting there shivering against the peg the way a gauge does when whatever it's measuring has gone past anything it was built to read. The cooling loop wasn't just running. It was running flat out, every pump it had wide open, drawing more than its circuit was ever meant to carry, fighting something with every last ounce of capacity it possessed. "It's redlined," I told Park, who'd followed me in and was standing close, too close, the way frightened people stand close. "The cooling for D is pulling past the rating of its own circuit. That's why the room's hot. That's why the lights are dying every few seconds out in the hall. Every time those pumps surge, they yank the whole bus voltage down and starve everything else on the bank. The lights, the controls, all of it. The loop is eating the base alive, trying to do its job." "Can you turn it down?" he asked. "Throttle it back so the batteries last?" I turned and looked at him the way you look at a man who has just, in complete innocence, suggested you cut your own throat. "Turn it down. Park, that loop is the only thing keeping whatever's in there cold enough to stay slow. You heard the line on your own terminal. Containment compromised. The cold is the containment. If I turn that loop down, I make whatever's coming arrive sooner. If I leave it up, I drain the bank faster and it still arrives just later, in the dark, when the batteries quit. You understand what I'm telling you? There's no setting on this board that fixes the problem. There's only settings that choose how we lose and when." That was the moment, standing in front of that hot board with the pinned needle shivering against its peg, when I stopped being an engineer who trusted systems and started being a man trapped inside one. Because I finally understood, all at once, that the system wasn't broken. Nothing in front of me was malfunctioning. The cooling loop was supposed to redline in an emergency, supposed to dump everything it had into holding the cold. The batteries were supposed to drain. The doors were supposed to seal and stay sealed. The reprogrammed warning was supposed to tell people the sky would kill them. The whole apparatus was working flawlessly, doing precisely the job it had been built to do. And that job was not to save us. That job was to contain whatever lived in Building D for as long as physical energy would allow. And then, when the energy ran out, to fail in the most controlled, most delayed, most survivable for the outside world way it possibly could. I had spent 19 years maintaining a coffin and calling it a base. I had greased the hinges on my own trap and been proud of how smoothly they swung. I found the load schedule taped inside the cabinet door. A laminated sheet gone yellow at the edges, my own handwriting on most of it from a revision I'd done 3 years back. I ran my finger down the lines out of pure habit, reading the priorities I'd set myself, and partway down, I found something that wasn't mine. A line had been added, in different ink, a darker blue, in a hand that wasn't my blocky engineer's print, but a quicker, slanted, educated hand. It had been added sometime after my last revision, and I'd never seen it before, which meant someone had been into this cabinet without telling me, into my cabinet, the one place on the base I'd have sworn no one touched but me. It read, "On battery transfer, shed all non-essential loads. Maintain D-COOL-PRI and Stair-7 lighting as priority 1. Authorized, Reyes. I knew the name. Dr. Marlene Reyes was the senior research lead in Building D, and I had met her exactly twice in 19 years. Both times, she had needed something cold and needed it fast, and had been entirely unwilling to tell me why. The first time was years back, some emergency with a chiller. The second time was more recent and more significant, and I felt the floor of my understanding tilt as the memory surfaced. She was the one who'd had the deep battery banks expanded 2 years ago. It had been a major project, one of the biggest I'd run in my whole tenure, tripling the storage capacity of the vault under Building C. And I had managed every foot of it, every cell, every cable. And I had never once understood why a caretaker research building needed enough stored power to run a small town for the better part of an evening. I'd asked once and been told it was for load resilience, which is the kind of phrase that means nothing and ends conversations. And I'd shrugged and built what they paid me to build. Now I understood. And the understanding came up cold through the soles of my feet. She hadn't expanded those batteries to keep the lights on. She'd expanded them to buy time, to buy a specific calculated quantity of time, measured in hours, between a containment failure and a dawn. She had been planning for this exact night for 2 full years. She had built the clock that was now ticking down on the wall around me. And she'd written Stair-7 lighting as priority 1. Stair-7, the stairwell I'd come down, the one that had bothered me from the first second I saw it lit. She had reached into my cabinet 2 years ago and made sure that when the doors fell, there would be a single lit path leading down from the surface into the lower level. And a lit path is an invitation. A lit path means come this way. She had wanted survivors of whatever happened up top to come down here, down to the cold, down to where I was now standing with a yellowed schedule in my hands and her handwriting under my thumb, in a room getting hotter by the minute. "Park," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me, flat. Reyes knew. Whatever's in D, she didn't just react to it tonight. She knew it was coming, maybe not the night, but the kind of night. And she built this whole sequence years ago to handle it. The doors, the expanded batteries, the reprogrammed warnings, the one lit stairwell drawing people down out of the killing air. I lifted my eyes from the schedule and looked down the row of cabinets toward the wall, toward the far end of the corridor beyond it, toward the door that led to D's service entrance. Which means she's one of 2 things right now. She's either down here with us, somewhere in this ground, waiting, or she's in there, in D, sealed in with the things she spent 2 years trying to contain. And as if the building itself had been listening for its cue, the radio on Park's belt crackled. It wasn't the flat, even hiss it had been giving us for the last hour, the white noise of dead air. It was a crackle, sharp, a break in the static, then a fragment of something that might have been a voice, then static again. We both went absolutely still. Park brought the radio up slowly, both hands around it now, and turned the volume wheel up with his thumb. And we stood in the hot dark and waited. not breathing. It came again. A woman's voice, exhausted past the far end of exhaustion, and very calm, the particular calm of someone who has already finished being afraid of dying because they have already accepted that they are going to. Anyone on the utility level? This is Reyes. If you can hear this, I'm transmitting on the maintenance band, low power, off the D-wing battery. It won't reach the surface. It physically can't. The band and the power won't carry through the structure. It'll only reach the corridor and the rooms off it. So, if you can hear me, you're down here. You're close. And I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I don't know how much longer I'll be making sense. Do not open the service door to Building D. I don't care what you hear through it. I don't care if it sounds like me. Do not open that door. Park fumbled for the transmit key, pressed it. Dr. Reyes, this is Lieutenant Park. I'm in the switchgear room with the facilities engineer, Vane. We can hear you. We read you clear. Where are you? Are you hurt? There was a long pause. So long that I was sure we'd lost her, that the battery had died, or she had. And Park's knuckles went white around the radio. Then her voice came back, slower. I'm in the secure wing, behind the inner containment door. I sealed myself in when I realized I couldn't get out the front, when the front was already... She stopped, started again. There were 9 of us in D tonight, working late, a full overnight team plus me. I need you to understand the count, because the count is the whole thing. There were 9. There are not 9 of us anymore. There is me, behind this inner door, still talking. And there is the rest of them, in the wing, in the space between me and you. And the only reason the rest of them are still on the wrong side of slow, the only reason any of us has had these last hours at all, is that cooling loop you're standing next to. The cold is the only thing holding them. Every degree counts. Do you understand me? I took the radio out of Park's hand, gently, and keyed it. Dr. Reyes, this is Hollis Vane, facilities engineer. I read you. I'm standing at the main board right now, and the cooling loop is redlined, drawing past its circuit rating, and the battery bank is bleeding out fast because of it. By my arithmetic, the bank dies somewhere around 5 in the morning. Sunrise is 06:12. I've worked the gap. I know there's an hour or more between the cold quitting and any daylight. So I need you to tell me, plainly, what happens at 5. What is it the cold is holding back? You've done the math. And there was something in her voice when she said it. Something almost like relief. The bone-deep relief of a person who has been screaming into a void and has finally heard a voice come back that speaks the same language she does. The language of numbers and systems and consequences. Good. Thank God. Somebody who's done the math. Then you understand the gap. And you understand the gap is the whole problem. At 5, the cold stops. And when the cold stops, the rest of them stop being slow. What are they, doctor? I need the word. Warm, she said. And it wasn't an answer. Until a half-second later, it became the only answer that had ever mattered. They run on temperature, mister. Vane. Whatever this is, and I'm not going to pretend over a radio that I fully understand what it is, it's metabolically driven by heat in a way nothing natural is. Below a certain core temperature, they barely move. They go sluggish. Below that, dormant. Down near freezing, they're almost statues, breathing maybe, twitching, but not coming for you. That is the entire principle of the containment. That is what I designed the whole power architecture around. Cold makes them slow. Cold buys time. So I built batteries to make cold last, to last through the night, until a hard team could come in, suited and equipped, and finish what needed finishing in the daylight. That was the plan. That was the entire plan. Her voice thinned. And I got the math wrong. I miscalculated the loop draw. I didn't account for how hard those pumps would fight once all of them in the wing had turned, how much heat that many bodies would put into the loop at once. The cold's holding, but it's burning the bank faster than I projected. I built for 7 hours. I'm going to deliver 3. I stood there in the hot dark with the radio warm in my hand, and the pinned ammeter shivering at the edge of my flashlight beam. And I felt the entire architecture of the night rearrange itself around me into its true shape. I had come down those stairs thinking the problem was a building running too warm, a fault to be traced and fixed. The problem was a woman who had built a clock to save a base full of people, and gotten one number wrong by 4 hours. And now her error was draining out of the wall in front of me 1 amp at a time, and the difference between the 7 hours she'd promised and the 3 she'd built was going to be paid for somewhere above us, in the sealed dark, in bodies. "There's no hard team coming," Park said. And he'd leaned in to speak into the radio I was holding. And his voice was quiet and careful and final. "Doctor, you need to know that. The comms are dead all the way out, base-wide, every band. The transmission can't leave the structure. You said so yourself. Nobody on the surface knows the doors came down. There is no signal getting off this point. No one is coming at dawn because no one knows there's anything to come for." The silence on the radio after that was the worst sound I had heard all night. Worse than the door falling. Worse than the smell on the stairs. It went on and on. Just the faint hiss of the open channel. And I could hear, under the hiss, the sound of her breathing. And I could hear in that breathing the exact moment her last plan died. "Then there's no morning rescue," she said at last. And her voice had changed, gone flatter, the calm gone past calm into something hollowed out. "Then the gap doesn't matter, does it? The gap only ever mattered because there was something waiting on the far side of it. There's nothing waiting." A long breath. "Mr. Vane, Hollis, you're the engineer. You built the bank. You know every cell in it. You know it far better than I ever did. I only knew what I needed it to do. So I need you to tell me the truth. And I need you to tell it fast, because I think I have a great deal less time left than you do. Is there any way at all, to make the cold last longer?" And there it was, stripped of everything else. The only question left in the world, not how to escape, not how to fight, not how to climb back up into a sky that would kill us, not how to wait for a help that wasn't coming. How to make the cold last. That was the whole of it. I closed my eyes, and I built the system in the dark behind them, the way I'd built it 10,000 times, cabinet by cabinet, cable by cable, load by load, the whole electrical body of the base laid out in my mind, like a man's own nervous system. And I found the answer. And the moment I found it, I hated it, because it was exactly the kind of answer that a man who has spent his whole life trusting systems is never, ever supposed to have to give. "There's one small way and one big way," I said. "The small way first. The bank right now is feeding the cooling loop, the corridor and stairwell lights, and a short list of other life safety loads, medical, suppression, the things the priority list keeps alive. The loop's the monster. It's most of the draw. But it isn't all of it. If I shed everything else, every light, every other system on this level, go fully dark, loop only, I buy maybe 40 minutes on the far end. That's real. But it's 40 minutes, not 4 hours, and we'll be sitting in the pitch black for all of it. And the big way. I opened my eyes and looked through the wall, toward the inland end of the corridor, toward the room I was thinking of. The desalination plant has its own battery. A completely separate bank, isolated, dedicated to running the brine pumps so the desal can keep making water in a grid-down event. It is not on the lockdown circuit. It was never tied into this emergency architecture on purpose, so a fault in one couldn't take the other. Which means right now, at this minute, that bank is sitting there fully charged, completely untouched by tonight. If I could cross-tie it into decool by hand in the switchgear, I'd roughly double the stored energy feeding the loop. I looked at the cabinets around me, at the bus bars I could see behind the open door. Dull copper carrying enough current to stop my heart in a fraction of a second if I so much as breathed on them wrong. Double the energy, double the cold. That gets you to 7 hours, maybe past it. That gets you to dawn, with or without anybody waiting on the other side of it. Then do it, Reyes said instantly, no hesitation at all. Whatever it costs, Hollis, do it. It's not that simple. It never is. Nothing on a switchboard is ever simple when it matters. To cross-tie those two banks, I have to physically open the main bus and bridge two systems that were specifically, deliberately isolated from each other so that they could never, under any circumstances, feed one another. And I have to do it while the bus is hot, while it's energized and carrying the loop. Because the second I de-energize the bus to work on it the way you're supposed to work on it, safely, dead verified, the cooling loop stops. And you have told me, very clearly, what happens when the loop stops. I gave a short laugh with nothing in it. She built me a perfect room, Park. Listen to it. To save the cold, I have to risk killing the cold. To work safe, I have to work dead, which kills the cold I'm trying to save. To work live, I keep the cold running, but I might fault the whole bus in one bad quarter second and lose everything at once, the loop included, instantly, in a single spark. Every door out of this problem opens straight back into the same room. What do you need? Reyes said. To do it. What would you need to do it cleanly? Time and a dead bus, I said, which are the two things I cannot have, because the dead bus is the thing that kills us. So I do it live, or I don't do it at all. There was a silence on the line, and then she asked the question that I think she already knew the shape of. And if you do it live, and you get the sequence wrong, then I fault the main bus. The protection trips, or worse, it doesn't trip fast enough and the bus flashes over. Either way, the loop dies on the spot. We don't lose 4 hours. We lose all 3 right now, in the time it takes to draw a breath, and probably me with it. I looked at the dull copper bars. Here's the whole bet, plain as I can make it. Right now we have 3 hours, guaranteed, money in the bank. The cross-tie is a coin flip. Heads, we get 7 hours, we reach the dawn. Tails, we lose everything in 1 second, the cold quits now, and whatever's in that wing wakes up while it's still the middle of the night. I want to stop the story right here for a second, because this is the choice that I still turn over in the dark, and all these years on. 3 hours, certain, in your hand, or a coin flip for 7. A sure thing that runs out in the blackness before a help that isn't coming. Against a gamble that either reaches the daylight or ends every single thing in a single white flash. If you have ever in your life had to stand in front of a choice like that, a known small loss against a 50-50 shot at survival, you know exactly how much that choice weighs, how it sits on your chest. Tell me what you'd have done. Then I'll tell you what I did. I started taking the cabinet apart. I told Park to back up, all the way out into the corridor, around the doorframe, with the steel of the wall between his body and the open bus, because if I faulted that bus, the arc flash would come out of the cabinet like the breath of a furnace, and it would take the eyebrows and a good deal more off any man standing where he was standing. He went, white-faced, and put his shoulder against the corridor wall where he could still hear me but couldn't be killed by my mistake. Then I worked. I knelt on the cool steel floor in front of the open cabinet, and I laid my tools out in a row, in the exact order I would need them. The insulated drivers, the bridge clamps, the disconnect handle, each one placed by feel so I'd never have to look away from the bars to find it. I took off my belt, and I looped one end around my left wrist and clipped the buckle to a steel strut of the cabinet frame, low and to the side. And I want to explain that because it matters, and it's a thing only men who've done this work would think to do. The single worst thing that can happen to a man working alone and live in a switchboard is to faint or flinch or stumble forward into the bus. So you tie yourself to fall backward. You give your body something to hang from that pulls you away from the death, not toward it. A man working live and alone needs a thing to fall away from. And Reyes talked to me the whole time. Low and steady on the radio I'd set on the floor beside my tools, volume up, a constant murmur of a human voice in my ear. And after a minute, I understood that she was doing it on purpose, that she was spending what was left of her own strength to keep a voice beside me, so that I would not be a man dying alone in a hot room in the dark. She knew the trick. She'd probably been using it on herself for 3 hours behind her own sealed door, talking to keep the part of her that was still her from going quiet. "Tell me about the loop's surge behavior," I said, working a driver into the first lug. "When the pumps spike, how long does a spike last, start to finish?" 2 to 3 seconds, she said. No hesitation, the data right there at the front of her mind. Then it settles back to the baseline draw. Why does it matter? Because if I'm making the bridge during a surge, the inrush from the cross tie stacks right on top of the pump draw, and the total exceeds anything the bus will tolerate, and it faults me out. I have to make the connection in the trough, in the quiet between surges. 2-3 seconds of clear window, that's all I get, and I have to do the most dangerous move inside it. I had the first cabinet fully open now, the bus bars bare in front of me, copper gone the dull brown of an old penny, and I could feel the heat radiating off them onto my face, like the open door of a stove. I can't watch the loop draw and make the connection at the same time. My hands and eyes are full. I need you to be my eyes. You said you have a monitor in there. I need you to watch the loop draw and call the troughs for me. Call them the way a man on the ground calls a plane down onto a deck. I'll move on your voice and only your voice. I can see the draw, she said. It's right in front of me on the wing monitor. It's still live on the D battery. I'll call it. Mr. Vane. Hollis. If this goes wrong, if you fault it, it won't go wrong, I said, which was a lie, a flat and obvious lie. And she knew it was a lie, and she let me have it anyway. Because sometimes a lie is a tool too. And a man with his hands an inch from a bus needs every tool he can hold. The first trough she called, I wasn't ready for it. Trough now, she said, and my hands were in the wrong place, and I let it pass. And the surge that came in behind it slammed the lights in the corridor down to a deep brown. And I felt the heat off the bars jump against my face, and I pulled my hands back into my lap and just breathed, slow in and out, until my heart climbed down out of my throat. The second trough, I got the first bridge clamp seated, copper to copper, my hands moving with that slow exactness that is the hardest discipline there is. Because every animal nerve in your body is screaming at you to move fast, to get your soft, mortal hands away from the thing that can kill you. And you have to overrule all of it and move slow, because slow is what doesn't slip, and a slip in there is the last mistake you make. The third trough, I got the second clamp on, and now the two banks were one single motion away from married, separated only by the disconnect link in my right hand. The link was a phenolic handle about a foot long, a tough brown insulating composite with a copper blade on the working end. And to complete the tie, I had to drive that blade home into a live slot at precisely the right instant, in the trough, between surges. Too early or too late, and I'd be making contact under load, and the whole thing would arc and fault, and that would be the end of all of it. I set the blade against the lip of the slot, just touching, my arm braced. "Next trough," Reyes said in my ear. "Get ready. It's coming. Wait." Her voice was a thread, but it was steady, steadier than mine would have been. "Surge incoming first. Wait, hold." The lights browned hard. The bars in front of my face began to sing. A low copper hum I felt in my back teeth and the fillings in them, the sound of enormous current bending the metal's own structure. I held the blade an inch off the slot, and I held my breath in my chest, and I watched, in the brown half-light, a single bead of my own sweat gather and fall off the end of my nose. And I tracked it the whole way down with my eyes, the way you'd track a falling man. Because if it landed across the bars, it would flash to steam and take my hand with it. It landed on the cool steel of the floor, beside my knee. Not on the bars. Thank God, not on the bars. "Truff," Reyes said. "Now, Hollis, now. Now." I drove the blade home. For 1/4 of 1 second, the entire world contracted to the inside of that bus, and I waited for it. The arc, the white flash brighter than the sun, the bang that would be the last thing my ears ever carried. I waited for the furnace breath to come out and take my face. It didn't come. The blade seated, clean, a solid mechanical click I felt up my arm. The two banks took hands, and out at the edge of my vision, the ammeter for D-cool, pinned hard in the red against its peg, eased. Just a hair. The needle came down off the stop and trembled and settled a fraction lower as the loop, for the first time all night, drank from a deeper well than it had been drinking from. And the brown, dying lights in the corridor came up to a steady, sullen amber and held there. And the whole room changed its pitch, the hum dropping into a register that I knew, with the bone certainty of 19 years, was a register the system could hold. "It's holding," Reyes breathed in my ear. "Hollis, it's holding. The bank Raidso Godit reads 7 hours and change. 7 hours. You did it. You bought the morning. You bought the whole morning." I sat back on the cool steel floor with my belt still clipped to the cabinet frame and my tied wrist still in the air. And I looked down at my hands, and they were shaking so hard I could not have held a screwdriver if my life had needed it. The fine tremor of a body that has been running on pure, controlled terror and has suddenly been allowed to stop. Park came back around the doorframe into the room, slow, and his face in the steady amber was wet, openly wet, and he didn't bother to hide it. And for about 90 seconds, the three of us, 2 men in a hot room, and a woman behind a sealed door at the far end of the corridor, let ourselves believe that we had won. 7 hours of cold, sunrise at 06:12. The gap closed, sealed, gone. All we had to do now was wait in the amber light and not open any doors, and let the cold carry us into the day. I should have known. A man who builds traps for a living should know that a system always has one more room hidden behind the room you think is the last one. It was Park who heard it first, because he was nearer the doorway, nearer the corridor. I saw his head come up and turn, saw him go rigid, his eyes fixing on something past me, down the hall. And then I heard it too, through the steady hum of the holding loop. A sound from the far end of the corridor. from the service door to Building D. It was not a pounding. I want to be precise about that, because it's the thing that made the hair stand up on my arms before my mind caught up. It was not the blind thrashing of something throwing itself against a door, not the dumb battering I'd half been braced for all night. It was a turning. A slow, deliberate, mechanical turning. Metal on metal. Patient. The absolutely unmistakable sound of a door handle being worked, carefully, from the other side. "Reyes," I said into the radio, very quietly, as though the volume of my own voice might somehow carry down 60 feet of concrete and through a steel door. "Something is opening the service door to D from the inside. The handle. It's turning the handle." The silence from her this time had a different texture than the others. It wasn't the silence of fear or of a dying battery. It was the silence of understanding. The terrible kind. The kind that arrives a few seconds too late and explains everything that came before it. "That's not one of the turned ones," she said. And her voice had dropped low and gone very careful. "Listen to me. The ones in the wing, the ones the cold is holding, they don't use handles. They don't remember handles. Whatever they were, the part of them that knew what a handle is for is gone. Burned out. It's one of the first things to go." A breath. And under the breath, faintly, I thought I heard another sound, a wet shifting, something moving in the room with her, or something moving in her. There were 9 of us in D tonight, Hollis. I told you that. Me and the rest in the wing. But I have to tell you the rest of it now, because it matters, and I'm running out of time to matter. The count never came out right, even by my own number. 9 minus me, minus everyone I watched turn, and it still left one over. One I couldn't place. A man who went quiet very early, right at the start. And I assumed he was simply dead, a casualty, gone. Her voice tightened. But he wasn't turning the way the others turned. He wasn't going slow and sluggish in the cold like the rest. He was becoming something else. Something the cold reaches differently. Slower, less. And he is the one. He's the only one in that whole wing who would still remember what a door handle is for. Down the corridor, the handle finished its turn. The latch let go with a soft, final click, a small domestic sound. The sound a door makes in any house in the world. And it landed in the center of my chest like a fist. And at the far end of the long amber corridor, the heavy service door to Building D swung slowly inward, into the black space beyond it, and stopped. And nothing came out. That was the worst of it somehow. Worse than if a thing had come boiling through. The door simply stood open onto a rectangle of total blackness, and the cold air the loop was generating poured through that opening the wrong way, toward us, carrying the smell up the corridor, the smell I'd caught faintly on the stairs an hour and a lifetime ago. Except now it was thick. Now it rolled down the hall like a fog, the full smell of the inside of a thing that should be dead and isn't. Park had his sidearm up and braced two-handed on the edge of the door frame, aimed down the corridor at the black opening. And I crouched beside him with nothing in my hands at all but a multi-tool and a flashlight I now did not dare switch on. Because light was the one thing I was suddenly certain the dark down there would come hunting toward. "Reyes," Park whispered. He didn't take his eyes off the open door. "What do we do?" "You don't shoot," she said, instantly and hard. "Whatever you do, Lieutenant, you do not fire that weapon. A gunshot in that corridor, with the loop running, the flash, the noise, the concussion of it in a concrete tube. It will wake every slow one in that wing all at once. You will trade one of him for 9 of them. and they will all come through that open door behind him toward the sound. Do not fire unless it is on top of you, and you're already dead anyway." "Then what?" I said low. "He's not coming through the door. He's just standing in the dark behind it. What do we do?" "Then you do the only thing this place left for you to do," Reyes said. And I heard her make a decision. Heard a woman who had built a clock and gotten the math wrong reach down for the last thing she had left to spend and decide exactly how to spend it. "You told me the cold makes them slow. And you told me the corridor and the stairwell lights are on priority 1, kept burning. Hollis, think about what that means physically. The lights are warm. Every fixture is a small source of heat. The lit corridor is the warmest path on this whole level, warmer than the cold-soaked wing he's standing in. He'll follow the warmth. He'll follow it in the open space, away from the cold of the wing, down the corridor toward you, toward the switchgear room, which is the hottest room down here. The room you and I both made hot, keeping that loop alive." I looked at the bus bars behind me. The heat I'd been cursing for an hour pouring off them into the room. And I understood with a cold drop of my stomach exactly what she was about to ask me to do. "There's a hatch," Reyes said, "on the seaward side of the corridor, about halfway down its length. It's marked SW-intake. Stenciled, you'll know it. It drops straight into the seawater intake plenum, the chamber that feeds the entire cooling system off the raw harbor. Right now, that plenum is flooded with seawater pulled off the bottom of the harbor in February. It is the coldest, darkest, deadest hole on this entire base. And here is the thing, Hollis. Here is the only thing that matters. There is no handle on the inside of that hatch. None. It opens from the corridor and from nowhere else." Her voice had gone completely steady now, the flat steadiness of someone reading off a procedure. "If you can get him into that plenum and close the hatch over him, the cold takes him in minutes. Minutes. And he never, ever comes out. But something has to bring him to it. Something warm and moving and slow enough and stupid enough to stand near an open hole in the dark with the one light on this whole base shining down on it." I knew what she meant. I knew exactly what she meant. She meant a man. She meant me. "There's another way," I started. "There isn't," she said. And she said it gently, which was worse than if she'd snapped it. "I have had 3 hours behind this door to find one, 3 hours and a mind that built this whole place. And there is no other way. You have something I don't have, Hollis. You have a body on the right side of the cold. You're warm, and you're whole, and you're still entirely yourself. I'm on the wrong side of it. I have been on the wrong side of it for about 20 minutes now. And the only reason I've still got my words is that I'm sitting against the chiller wall in here, pressed to the cold metal, holding the temperature down in myself by hand, buying my own minutes the same way I tried to buy yours. And I'm spending the last of them talking to you fast, because I wanted to finish being useful before I finish being me. That's why my breathing's gone wrong. That's why I told you, the very first thing, not to open my door no matter what you heard through it. I'm one of them now, Hollis. I just get to keep my words a little longer than the rest of them did. The cold is the only reason I have any words left at all. And it is running out of me a great deal faster than your batteries are running out of cold." Park looked at me. In the steady amber, his young face had aged years in an hour. I looked away from him, down the corridor at the open black doorway, and at the place on the seaward wall, halfway down, where I now knew there was a hatch I'd repainted myself 8 years ago and stepped over 1,000 times, without one thought, marked SW-intake in white stencil paint. "I'm going to ask you the last thing I'll ask you tonight. and then I'll finish it, because we're near the end now. Reyes did the math on a whole base full of living people and got it wrong by 4 hours, and 4 hours of error were going to be paid for by 8 lives in the dark above us. And then she did the math one final time on herself, on the last 20 minutes she had left. And she asked me to spend her plan and my own warm body to close a hole in the world. Did she have the right to ask that of me? Did I have the right to do it, to stand over that hole and be the bait? I've never decided. Tell me what you think, because I've carried the question a long time, and I'm tired of carrying it alone. This is what I did. I told Park to get into the deep battery vault and seal the door behind him. The vault was the one sealed, cold, dead quiet room on the whole level. The one place a warm body could hide from a thing that hunted warmth. Because the vault was packed wall to wall with the battery cells, and they were running cold. And a cold room reads as nothing to a thing that follows heat. And because somebody had to be alive when the daylight came, somebody had to be there to tell the hard team, if a hard team ever came, where the bodies were and which doors to never, ever open. He argued with me. He was 26, and he argued the way a man argues when he still believes the chain of command is real and solid and will catch him. And I took him by the front of his uniform, and I told him the chain of command was a sealed steel door and a dead radio, that there was no OOD, no gate, no Navy left on this point that could hear him, and that the only order remaining on the whole of Cormorant Point was the one I was giving him right now. And something in my face, or my voice, finally reached him. He went. I watched him cross to the vault and haul the heavy door open and step into the cold dark of it and pull it shut. And I heard the bolts throw home, 1, 2, 3, solid. Then I went to the switchgear board, and I shed every load on the corridor except one. I want you to picture it. I killed the lights one by one down the length of the hall, watching the darkness eat back toward the open door of D, until there was only a single fixture left burning. The one directly above the SW-intake hatch, a hard cone of warm amber light falling straight down onto bare steel deck plate. Then I went out into that dying corridor, into the cold and the smell, and I knelt at the hatch and worked the dogs loose and swung it up on its hinge so the black square mouth of the plenum stood open under the light. And immediately the February seawater cold came breathing up out of it, a raw, salt, mineral cold that fogged in front of my face. And then I went back, one last time, to the board. And I killed the cooling loop. I want you to understand exactly what killing the loop meant, because it was the real cost of the night. The one buried underneath the cost I was about to pay with my own body. Killing the loop meant the slow ones in the wing, all 8 of them. The ones the cold had been holding sluggish and dormant would begin to warm and to wake. It meant that the 7 hours I had bled my shaking hands raw to buy were gone, erased, the instant I threw that breaker. But the loop was the warmest, loudest, most alive thing on the entire level. And as long as it ran, it would pull him, the 9th one, the one who remembered handles, toward the switchgear room, and toward me, standing in the wrong place. I needed the warmest thing in the corridor to be that single light over the open hole. I needed the second warmest thing to be me, standing right beside it. I needed to be the lure. And a lure cannot compete with a red-lined cooling loop roaring in the next room. So I killed the morning to buy the hole. I went out and I stood in the cone of amber light over the open black water, with the plenum cold rising around my ankles and creeping up my torn boot. And I made noise. I scuffed the bad heel of my boot against the deck plate, scrape, scrape. I breathed loud and ragged on purpose. I was the warmest, dumbest, a most alive thing in a cold, dark corridor, standing at the lip of an open hole, and somewhere down the black throat of Building D's open door, the thing that remembered handles turned toward the warmth and the light, and began, slowly, deliberately, to come. I heard it long before I saw it. Not footsteps, exactly. A wet, dragging, deliberate sound, with a hitch in it. The sound of a thing moving with full purpose inside a body that no longer entirely consents to be moved. A body being driven rather than lived in. The smell rolled ahead of it down the hall, thickening, until it was the only thing I could breathe. And then it was there, at the very edge of the dark, just outside the reach of the amber cone. And I made myself raise my eyes and look at what had been the 9th person in Building D that night. The one Reyes never accounted for. The one the cold touched differently. I won't describe him to you. Some things you carry up out of a place like that, and you never set them down again where other people have to look at them. I'll tell you only this, that his head came around toward the bright cone of light over the open hatch, and held there a moment, and then it turned, slowly, toward me, the warmer thing standing just beside it. And he chose me, exactly the way she said he would. And he came on. I waited. That was the whole of the trick, and it was the single hardest thing I have ever done in the length of my life. I let him come. I stood at the lip of the hole in the warm light, and I watched him cross the last of the dark toward me. And I waited until he was past the near edge of the hatch. Until he was reaching. Until the next step he took toward me would have to come down on the steel between the open water and the light. I felt the cold of him. A different cold than the plenum's, a wrong cold. And then I stepped back. One long step, backward, out of the cone, into the cold dark on the far side. And I took the warmth of myself with me, away from him. He followed the warmth. He followed it the way she swore he would. His weight already committed. His foot already swinging forward to where I'd been. And he stepped where I had stood. And the steel wasn't there, because the steel was the open hatch. And he went down into the seawater intake plenum, down into the black February water, with a sound I will be hearing on the inside of my own skull for the rest of whatever life I have left to me. And I came forward fast into the cold, and I put both my hands flat on the hatch, and I drove it down, hard, and I threw the dogs and locked them, one after another. And there was no handle on the inside of that hatch. There never had been. And below me, the February harbor closed over him in the dark. I sat down on the closed hatch in the blackness, in the cold, and I stayed there a long time. The cooling loop was dead. I could hear, very faintly, very far down the black corridor through the still open service door, the slow ones in the wing of Building D beginning to warm and stir, beginning to find their feet, beginning to move, no longer slow. I had traded the morning for the whole. I had closed one threat into the cold and woken 8 more into the dark. And the only safe room left on the whole level was a battery vault with a 26-year-old lieutenant sealed inside it. And the only thing standing between him and the 8 things now waking up was a steel door and the cold of a bank that I had just, with my own hand, stopped feeding. The radio in my pocket crackled one last time. Reyes. Her voice was different now, slower, coming apart at the edges, the words drifting out of true. But she found them anyway, one at a time, the way she'd promised me she could hold them a little longer than the rest. Did it work? She said. It worked, I told her. He's in the plenum. The hatch is dogged. There's no handle. He's not coming back. Good, she said. A long, wet, dragging breath. The boy. In the vault. Tell him. The bank he's sitting inside, it's isolated. It's off the lockdown circuit. It's still full, and it's still cold. And it'll hold that vault door cold for hours, yet, even with the loop dead. A cold door. A cold room. They won't want it. They follow warmth, and there's no warmth in there. Tell him to stay in the cold, and stay still, and stay quiet, and wait for the light to come up the stairwell. Another breath, longer, harder to come back from. You bought the morning after all, Hollis. Not for the base. I'm sorry about the base. But for him, 1 man instead of 9. That's the math finally coming out right. That's the only sum I ever really wanted out of any of this. Reyes, I said. Get behind something. Get to the cold metal. Hold your words a little longer. I'm done with words, she said. I've spent them where they needed spending. Tell the hard team, if one ever comes. Building D, the wing. The plenum, dogged, never open it. Tell them the cold is the only weapon there is. Tell them I'm sorry about the 4 hours. I really did try to build 7. A pause so long I was certain she was gone, that the cold had finished running out of her. Then, very quietly, almost gently, almost to herself, it's a strange thing, Hollis, to spend 2 years of your life building a clock to save people, and have it come out the far end, saving exactly 1. I'd have liked it to be more. I'd have liked it to be all of you. And then the radio went to hiss, and it stayed there, and it never said anything to me again. I made my way back up the black corridor with my flashlight off, navigating by the memory of a hallway I'd known for 19 years. Past the open black doorway of Building D, past the sounds inside it of things finding their feet in the dark. And I came to the battery vault, and I put my mouth right against the seam of the door, and I told Park everything she'd told me. Stay in the cold. Stay still. Stay quiet. Cold door, cold room, they won't want it. Wait for the light. He asked me, through the steel, to open up and let him pull me in. I told him there wasn't room in the cold for 2 warm bodies giving off 2 bodies worth of heat. And he was a smart young man, and he understood what I was really telling him, and he stopped asking. Then I went and found the coldest place left for a man on the right side of the cold, which was down a service ladder into the seawater intake gallery, a low steel room where the raw February harbor ran through the great pipes a foot from my face, breathing its cold into the dark. I wedged myself back into the coldest corner of it, between the pipes, soaking the warmth out of my own body into the steel, making myself as cold and as quiet and as much like nothing as a living man can make himself. And I went very still, and I waited for 0612. The hard team came at 0640, suited in the thin gray light of a winter dawn, because somebody on the outside had finally noticed that a base that doesn't exist had sealed every door it had and gone silent on every channel. They found Park alive in the vault, cold to the bone and shaking and entirely sane. They found me in the intake gallery, hypothermic, 2 fingers on my right hand, frozen past saving, but breathing. They found the plenum hatch dogged shut, and they did not open it, because by then I had told them. And Reyes was right about all of it. The cold was the only weapon, and there are some doors a wise man leaves cold forever. I think about her math all the time. I think about it more than I think about almost anything else from my whole life. 7 hours she needed. 3 she built, 4 she got wrong, and 8 people that error cost. 8 people who slept above us in rooms I kept the lights on for. And then the very last sum she ever worked. The one that came out right. The one that traded her 2-year plan and my warm hands and two of my fingers, and a thing I watched go down into the black water for exactly one young man sealed in a cold steel room. 1 instead of 9. I used to believe in systems. I used to believe in redundancies that hold, in pressure on a gauge that stays where it ought to, in a base that does precisely and reliably what its design tells it to do. Now I believe that the systems are only ever as good as the worst number some tired person got wrong in the dark, and that when they finally fail, and they all finally fail, the only thing left in the whole world that matters is whether there's someone willing to stand in the warm light at the lip of the open water and be stupid enough and brave enough and tired enough of being right to take one step back at the last possible second and let the code do the rest. The base still isn't on any map. The plenum is still dogged shut. And somewhere in a cold room under the seawall, the February harbor is still keeping the 9th one for me, down in the dark, with no handle on his side of the door